today's plan, we'll hear about Ukrainian GROMADA's resilience and, of course, about citizen assemblies in war context. And we will see how these are connected, how citizen participation and citizen empowerment can be realized through deliberative processes, but also how this leads to resilience in socially disruptive conditions as armed conflict. Of course, we have a Q&A session at the end, and I welcome all of you to add your questions in the chat, both in English and in Ukrainian, and we'll be delighted to address as many of your questions as possible. About our speakers, we are very honored and delighted to host Myroslava Savisko and Dr. Leslie Ann Duvic-Paoli. Myroslava is a manager of research projects at the Ukrainian think tank Kyiv School of Economics Institute, and she focuses on resilience of local communities and regional development research projects. Dr. Leslie Ann Duvic-Paoli is an associate professor in environmental law at King's College London and a member of its Center for Climate Law and Governance. Leslie Ann's scholarship covers the international environmental obligation of states, the global legal implications of the clean energy transition, and the role of participatory rights in climate governance. She's currently staying at the Paris Institute for Advanced Study, and she's working on her new book entitled Reimagining Climate Legislation, Citizen Assemblies and the Making of Environmental Law. Again, we're very glad and honored to have you both here today. And with no further ado, I would like to give the floor to our first speaker, Myroslava. The floor is yours.
Thank you all, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. I will focus during my presentation mostly on the resilience of Ukrainian communities in general. I think it's important for all kinds of challenges that the country is facing during the war, whether those are ecological, environmental, or of other origin. Everything that I'm presenting today is based on the research paper that my colleagues and I developed last year, and it's called Explaining Ukraine's Resilience to Russia's Invasion, the Role of Local Governance. And I will later share the QR code where you could read and accustom yourself to more details. Please, next slide. So the main difficulty, and I think you might be aware of this, is the first question of how we define resilience and what is actually behind this concept. And during our research, we faced a couple of major difficulties with this task. First of all, the majority of literature is looking at resilience during the natural disasters, and not in the context of interstate wars. Therefore, that was one of the first things that we faced as an issue. And the second one was the fact that the war is still ongoing, and therefore there's no traditional coming back to the normal. So the shocks are continuous. There are some of them already like people adjust and know how to react to those, while there are throughout these 3 years there were new and new shocks that appeared. And therefore, from this two main challenges, we decided to look predominantly to the documents that have been already in place in Ukraine, specifically in the Council of Defense and Security of Ukraine, which in 2021 prepared the concept of national resilience, I think, and there was 3 main dimensions that we also adapted to our research. And basically, it is about preparedness. So how communities are can foresight different challenges and risks, and how prepared they are to those risks. The second one is robustness, basically how the local communities and specifically local authorities can continue deliver the services they have to deliver by constitution. And adaptation, this is the ability of local communities to come up with new strategies and new ways of delivering maybe new services based on these upcoming shocks that appear. And based on that, we had a specific operationalization of each of these dimensions of resilience, and it was mainly covered by surveys of local authorities, either the head of local community or deputy head who filled in our surveys. And I would ask to put the next slide, please. And here are some of the results. So with this preparedness index and the dimension of resilience as preparedness, we had the 14 different measurements of how communities could have for example, stored some goods and water in case of emergencies, or whether they have updated the emergency plans or evacuation plans for the residents of their communities. And based on the answers of local authority heads, we made this index of preparedness. And as you can see on the map, we didn't have overall in Ukraine there are more than 1,000 communities. In total there were 1,470 before the full-scale war, and with the full-scale war a lot of them were occupied and obviously could not fully participate in the survey. And as you can see, there are not many communities that that received high score on this preparedness index. And we also conduct, right now, there is a second wave of similar research. And a bit negative and troubling thing is that in a lot of communities, this index remained low despite the fact that the war is ongoing for the third year already. And I would ask to put the next slide. And here is the robustness. You might wonder why there are more communities on this slide than on the previous. That's because the data was collected during different time periods, and this was the data collected in June 2022, while the previous slide was in November 2022. And we mainly suppose that with time the local communities have the what we call survey fatigue and are less ready to participate in different kind of surveys in which they do not see the value for themselves immediately. Despite this, the number of GROMADAs that participated were 474. And in this robustness, basically the questions focused on whether they stopped the delivery of some services in their communities, specifically communal sector, for example, garbage collection, after the start of invasion, and if they stopped, for how long did they stop this delivery. And as you can see, the situation is also very different within Ukraine. But generally, I think we could see the trend that most of the communities could handle, and despite the full-scale invasion, continued to deliver the most needed services. Please, next slide. Adaptation, again, this question were added in November 2002. Therefore, there are less observations, and here we focused on the adaptations that communities prepared, knowing that there are already there were some electricity cuts following Russia's shellings of energy infrastructure. This started in October 2022. And basically, we suggested the list of different things that local communities could have done to prepare to such shellings and still deliver and still allow their residents to use electricity and other services in their communities. And next slide. So everything that I was telling before, there was still this part of the big conceptualization. And basically one of the key questions that we were asking ourselves about is whether there are some things that affecting why some communities or GROMADAs are scoring better at preparedness, robustness, and adaptation than others. And we identified a couple of groups of predictors for resilience. Some of them are coming from the our observations and anecdotal evidence, such as demographic, geographical, and wartime experiences. So basically the idea was that the type of GROMADA, whether it is a village community or whether it's an urban community, could have affected the way how local authorities worked on these different dimensions of resilience. Geographical factor would be how close they are to the borders of Russia and Belarus, or to the EU, this aspect. And then the wartime experience, basically whether the occupation and the military actions taking place in GROMADA could have affected the resilience score. And next slide. And another group of predictors were coming from the literature. So Norris et al. Was having these groups of different predictors, mainly economic development and social capital groups of predictors that we also used in our research to check whether the own budget revenues of local authorities or the different business support centers or the voter turnouts at the previous years could have affected how local authorities scored at the resilience, different dimensions of resilience. Here, I would also pay attention to this, to the fact that the metrics that we chose was defined. We were limited by the available data open in the open sources, because a lot of the data that could have been more better, basically metric of these predictors that we saw in the literature were just not available at that point of time in Ukraine. Please, next slide. I'm slowly moving to the findings, and I'm here in the presentation. I will say those that our team found the most interesting. But as I mentioned before, I strongly encourage to look at the full paper and read the full text. The main focus that, for example, in this preparedness and robustness dimension, there was a positive relation between the preparedness and urban type of GROMADA. What that means, that basically the local authorities that were located in the cities, they have better plans or stored more goods and water, or had better or just had in place updated evacuation plans and so on. But a bit contrary was found with the robustness. So there, the full suspension of administrative services and other services were observed in urban types of gromadas. Such findings could be found controversial, but how we interpreted them was that with preparedness, a lot of these plans were required for a longer period, specifically for the bigger cities. And the decentralization reform that took place in 2014 basically continued to 2020, and a lot of gromadas that were just amalgamated in 2020 were village or settlement type, and therefore they didn't have sufficient period of time to prepare some of these documents or specific sectors. And then with the suspension, that's we didn't quite had the explanation for such result in this with the suspension of services. Another finding was the stronger economies and longer governance experience. By stronger economies, there was this own revenue indicators. So once again, basically the communities that earned more own resources, they scored better on this preparedness index. And with the longer governance experience, we also had the indicator of the status of the city, and that's similar to what I explained in the previous point. So the kind of resources and the kind of management that were requested from local communities in Ukraine before the decentralization reform were different, whether it was the city of oblast significance, or whether it was oblast center, or whether it was just the village town, and so on. And based on that, so for example, some cities could govern and have their different social economic plans and so on since 1991. While others would only start to develop them in 2015 and later. And last but not least, the collaboration capacities and democratic practices. So we saw a positive relationship between the adaptation dimension of resilience and voter turnout, as well as physical hubs and preparedness. And additionally, the indicator that worked best throughout all the dimensions of resilience, the number of agreements between one community and other communities. Basically, the more partners gromadas have in different parts of Ukraine, the better it's scored on robustness as well as adaptation and preparedness. And I would ask to put the next slide. The limitations, as I mentioned before, first of all, we focus only on institutional stability as part of our resilience research, and it's only basically looks at the local authorities' perspective, while there's definitely a big chunk of overall resilience due to local NGOs and other actors. And then also the use of self-reported data and the limited number of observations that could have also affected the outcomes of this research. And the general conclusions. Next slide, please. So on the one hand, we did find a confirmation that the some of the aspects that Norris et al. Identify in their research has also worked on in our case. Then what we also wanted to highlight is that the amount of resources is actually not as important as the ability to generate resource. That's a link to what I mentioned before, the own resources of GROMADAs, that basically what is the local authorities could generate themselves and not receive from the central budget, for example. And the importance of both physical hubs and virtual networks for ensuring preparedness. That's something that I think was widely spread within Ukraine during the period of 2014 and 2022, that it's not just the idea of community as the as a place where the services are delivered, but also the local authorities as this mediator between different actors, and that they could really bring different actors together. And therefore, we conclude with the value of the decentralization reform is really crucial to the overall resilience of Ukraine in this war. And also, this is stemming from the autonomy that the local authorities received since 2014. And we also highlight the importance of fostering municipalities' economic capabilities, as well as social networks and citizen participation to strengthen their resilience to different shocks that happened within this war. And I'm closing up here with my last slide, which would just provide you with different QR codes on this paper specifically, as well as we have the open data repository where you can find some of the data that we used within this research. And also we had quite a lot of other different research on resilience on our website that I'm greatly encourage you to also look at. For example, we have the recent publication just last week of the democratic resilience. So basically what's changed with different democratic practices since the full-scale invasion outbreak. I hope I managed within the time that I had, and thank you a lot.
Thank you very much, Myroslava, for sharing such special and unique, I would say, insights. I made sure I took some notes, and I highly encourage all of you to check the links and the study of Myroslava and her team, which I found perhaps the very pioneering, if not the only, among the few studies available about Ukrainian GROMADA's resilience right now. Right into the next speaker, Leslie-Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for a very kind invitation to speak today. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be with you all. So I'm going to be talking about citizens' assemblies and environmental governance, trying to understand what can be the contribution of citizens' assemblies on environmental protection and climate change, and what might be the potential in areas that are affected by conflict. So my presentation will first start with a general presentation of what are citizens' assemblies and why do I consider them to be an important trend, an emerging trend in climate governance and climate law. And then I'll be discussing their potential impact for environmental justice and also on environmental law. Next slide. So to get us started, just a short definition and explanation of what a citizens' assembly is. It's a group of citizens who have been selected randomly by lot to be representative of a broader society. So in terms of different criteria such as gender, education, where do they live, their profession, etc. And they are brought together and asked to make policy recommendations on how to meet certain public policy objectives. And today we're going to be talking about environmental protection, but we've seen citizen assemblies also being held on quite a large range of public policy issues, ranging from reform to an electoral system, to same-sex marriage and other public policy issues. A citizen assembly is a type of mini public that inserts itself into quite a wide variety of public participation mechanisms. And what is unique about a citizen assembly is that it involves a fairly lengthy process. So usually it's a work that will take place over several weekends, over several months, not just something that is just happening within 1 or 2 days. And it usually involves over 100 participants. So there are, of course, smaller types of citizens' juries, bringing together a smaller number of people over a smaller amount of time. But when we are talking about citizen assembly, it tends to be a fairly organized, heavy, formalized process. And a citizen assembly works in 3 different phases. The first one is a phase of learning, so explaining to the citizens what they will be talking about and deliberating upon. So they are being presented with some scientific knowledge on climate change and environmental degradation. What are the facts in order for them to make informed decisions? Then there's a phase of deliberation, meaning that they are exchanging their views and their perspectives in order to try and reach a form of consensus. And then a phase of decision where they try and make policy recommendations about how the governments, national, regional, or local, should be responding to the climate problem. What we've seen in recent years, and I'm going to show that in a minute, is really a proliferation of these citizens' assemblies on climate and environment. But what we are also seeing is that the mandates they are given, so the questions the citizens are asked, the design of these assemblies and their outcomes tend to vary very significantly. So when I'm talking about a climate assembly, actually, I'm talking about very different types of assemblies that have been designed very differently. And I'm going to be showing a few examples in a minute. Next slide, please. So the idea of citizens' assemblies is that they are a response to what is generally considered a democratic crisis in the West. So citizens' assemblies are here to renew democracy as we know it today, and somehow respond to a certain extent to the shortcomings of traditional conventional forms of democracy. It's particularly important in the context of climate change and environmental protection, as we see that usually governments have been struggling to actually provide adequate answers to the climate emergency. So citizens' assemblies are here to remedy the problems that are linked to election cycles, short-termism of elected people. That means that they cannot think over the long term, which is what climate governance requires, different types of influences and lobbies on the decision-making process, and also the fact that trying to govern the climate and the environment is extremely complex, and trade-offs always need to be made and decided upon. Is it better to facilitate access to energy to the detriment of a reduction in greenhouse gases, or do we privilege actually the climate crisis over other social issues? So citizen assemblies can be either bottom up, meaning that they are being organized by NGOs, local organizations, with the aim of influencing governments and public authorities, or they can be top down, meaning that it's public authorities that think that actually they need to have the involvement of citizens in a way that is quite different from the traditional electoral process, which usually does not really, is not very popular anymore, and that citizen assemblies are a way of ensuring that democratic practices continue in different forms. So these citizen assemblies are usually supported by grassroots movements. So for instance, Extinction Rebellion movement is very much in favor. One of their usually their asks for action from governments is the organization of climate assemblies. The idea with climate assemblies is that they are built on this idea of deliberation, and that deliberation is able to bring different types of perspectives and different types of expertise. So it's not only the expertise of politicians and experts and scientists, but it's also the expertise and the knowledge of the people on the ground who have very different types of knowledge, but knowledge that is indeed very valuable. The idea is that with deliberation, people will think more about the common good and not their own individual interests, and that the voices of people who are usually marginalized are amplified because the citizen assembly has been organized in a way that it has to be representative of a broader society. But there are also shortcomings, and I think it's also important to recognize those. There are risks of political manipulation. So when public authorities organize these assemblies, it might just be to actually give legitimacy to a decision that has already been made, for instance, and to say, well, citizens actually approved what we had already decided. Sometimes there's no impact afterwards on decision-making processes. So it's just a pro forma way of saying we've involved citizens, we've listened to the public, but nothing happens afterwards. And of course, because all the citizens are equal in this process, we are actually not over-amplifying the voices of people that are marginalized. And so it means that it might be that people who will tend to talk more in this deliberative processes have more of a voice than others. Next slide, please. So when it comes to citizen assemblies on climate change, we've seen that, at least in Europe, we've seen a proliferation since 2017 of these types of mini publics. And this has built upon the environmental democracy principle of public participation that is quite strong in Europe, in particular with the Aarhus Convention on Public Participation, but realizing that it was just insufficient and that we needed new ways of involving the public. So here you've seen, I've put a map that is taken from the wonderful website called KNOCA, the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, and that shows in red climate assemblies that have been held at the national level, and in green climate assemblies that have been held at a more regional or local level. So what has been very striking is that at the national level, we've seen really this trend move from the first few climate assemblies that have been held in Ireland, the UK, and France, and then being replicated across a number of European countries. This has been the first wave of experimentation, and I think the main lesson that has been learned so far is that climate assemblies do tend to work. So we see that citizens are taking this seriously and are able to make proposals that are considered to be serious, but that there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of how these assemblies need to be designed. Next slide. So just to give you a few illustrations, and I'm going to go quite quickly on this, but just to make this more practical, these have been in Ireland, the UK, and France, the first 3 citizen assemblies held on climate change at the national level. And the questions that were asked to the citizens were quite similar, but all a little bit different. In Ireland, the question has been, how can the state make Ireland a leader in tackling climate change? In the UK, the assembly was organized just after the adoption by the UK of its net zero target by 2050. So the question was really, how do we actually meet this target, and what should be the measures that need to be implemented in order to meet the target? And in France, the assembly was organized after the Yellow Vest movement in France. And so the question was really, how do we reduce our emissions in a way that is socially just? So trying to combine this idea of mitigating climate change, but doing it in a way that is socially acceptable and socially just. Next slide, please. So what have been the outcomes of these 3 assemblies? So they have been very different, and that's what also I was saying in terms of how it's difficult to compare between the assemblies. In Ireland, the outcome of the assembly has been 13 different proposals to the state to cut emissions. And I've given for each of these assemblies just a quick example to show what came out of these. So in Ireland, one of the proposals was the state should act to ensure the greatest possible levels of community ownership in all future renewable energy projects by encouraging communities to develop their own project. And eventually it led to the adoption of a new law, the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development in 2021. In the UK, we have a very different approach, and the Citizen Assembly was organized not and was mandated not by the government, but by the parliament to scrutinize what the government was doing. So the approach here was to ask citizens to write a very long report on how to reach the net zero targets. And then this report has been used by the government to inform the development of existing policies, but the report and the recommendations have not been directly translated into a new law. In France, this has been the opposite. The government has asked citizens to draft new laws and new provisions that had been President had promised that these proposals would be sent directly and without filter to the parliament, which nevertheless deliberated and debated these proposals. But we've seen the adoption of a new law directly as a result of a citizen assembly on climate and resilience, and other executive decisions made as a result of these legal provisions. Next slide, please. So now moving to what does it mean in context of war? Well, we have very limited empirical evidence of how a climate assembly would work at a fairly formalized level in an area affected by conflict. But we can see, if we think theoretically, quite some advantages to using this model. The first one is that it can help decide on high-level priorities in a way that is transparent and inclusive. It empowers citizens that might be displaced and that might not have a possibility of voting, and it gives them really a voice in the recovery and reconstruction of their country or area. It's using different types of knowledge and experience, and this is of course very important in terms of accessing evidence on environmental degradation in a way that really empowers the knowledge of the people on the ground. It's facilitating consensus building based on shared values, and so it's reducing conflicts and potential for polarization. And it's promoting long-term thinking, contrary to what representative democracy proposes. It's here enhancing long-term thinking for meaningful construction, while at the same time strengthening the resilience of democratic processes. At the same time, there might be some risks. Citizens' assemblies can be very complex, they are costly, and very time-consuming to organize. So it needs to be done very well in order for it to work, and you need to have citizens mobilized from all segments of society for it to be representative and mobilized over a certain period of time. In addition, it should be designed to complement representative institutions and not to replace them. This is not a replacement of representative institutions, it's just an additional way of enhancing democratic processes. Next slide. But the idea is that a citizen assembly can enhance environmental justice in very different ways. It will empower individuals to decide what justice means in a specific context and how they want to see environmental justice implemented. However, when we design a citizens' assembly, we need to think about whose justice we are thinking about. Are we thinking about justice towards the youth and future generations? In which case, we've seen that citizens' assemblies tend to give a slightly more important voice to young people. So for instance, people that are under 18 and might not be able to vote tend to be invited still. For instance, if they are 16 or 17, they are invited to citizen assemblies in order to have a voice in the deliberations. There are also ways of involving children, for instance, in these assemblies to get also their perspective on how they would like their country to respond to the climate crisis. How do we also involve citizens beyond borders? Environmental protection and in particular climate change are global issues. So how do we actually deliberate locally, regionally or nationally while taking into consideration others and other countries that might be affected by what is happening on the ground on our territory? And can we also think about how to be just towards nature? And can we only think in citizen assemblies about the interest of humans, because of course the humans are doing the deliberation, or can we also think about how to take into consideration nature and the environment more broadly? Next slide and final slide. What we see with these assemblies in terms of their impact, so I think it's important to think about, do they make a difference? Is that their impact can be quite varied. There's been some direct impact on law and policy, as I've seen you, for instance, in France or in Ireland, we see that some climate laws have been adopted as a result of these deliberative mechanisms. And it's the same thing at more local levels with citizen assemblies that have been held in a number of towns around Europe. We see that they've had some kind of influence on decision makers. They can also be taken into consideration more broadly by public authorities or used by public institutions. So used as an understanding of what citizens want to see, what their preferences might be, but not directly translated into law. They might also help just initiate public debates about what environmental degradation is, what should be done in terms of climate mitigation. And they can also change the behaviors of participants. If that's only what it does, it's still something, because it educates a number of people from very different segments of a society that then talk to their neighbors and colleagues, etc., about what they have learned in these assemblies. So as we can see, quite a lot of potential, some risks, and still quite a lot of questions about how to apply this mechanism in an environment of conflict. Next slide. Just some references here, just to acknowledge also the amazing work that my colleagues have been doing in terms of thinking about what deliberation means, and all of these references should be available online, open access. Thank you very much